I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. In the previous episode, I had a conversation with singer-songwriter Corrie Lynn Green explaining some aspects of studio technology and how it applies to musicians. In this second installment, we talk about headphones and how they can affect a performance, what happens to the microphone signal after it leaves the studio and gets to the control room. We discuss consoles, mic preamps and digital recorders, mixing and sound manipulation, loudness and what it means, and reduced file size formats like MP3 and how best to use those files. We normally use headphones for everybody to hear each other, which is a necessity when you're in the other room.
Right.
Then we have to make sure that what everybody has in their headphones is proper for them.
Right.
There's other sessions I do where we don't use any headphones because everybody's in the room playing together and you don't need them, which I think is like a real liberating thing for musicians to just be able to play naturally.
Yeah.
And we may be able to do some of those kinds of things on your songs at some point, but it is an option.
Although I don't really mind the earphones.
Yeah, no, you adapted very well to the studio environment.
Yeah.
But the headphones are really critical because you have to be able to hear everything that's going on in a balance that gives you a good sense of what the song is like. And you can hear yourself so that you're not isolated, because the headphones we use are pretty isolating.
Yeah.
And we do that because we don't want the sound that leaks out of the headphones to get into the microphones.
Okay, right. Because
you'll hear it. And most of the time it's not an issue.
Oh.
You know, we were listening to a multi-track recording last night, somebody else. And if you listen to the individual tracks of the vocal, you could hear the headphones.
Oh, my goodness. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, but didn't stop those from being successful records.
Okay.
But there is a limit.
Okay.
And so we try to minimize that. There's always this, I shouldn't say always, but often a conflict between how loud does somebody want their headphones to be and how much can we tolerate the sound of those headphones getting into the microphone.
Oh, wow.
There's a point where the level is plenty enough for everybody, but not so loud that it creates a problem. And then there's a question of the balance between the various instruments in people's headphones. Generally, what I do is I just give you the same mix of the instruments as what I'm listening to begin with.
Yeah.
95% of the time, that's all that's needed.
It's enough, yeah.
Everybody can hear just fine.
Yeah.
It used to be, and this is because, I get to work with really good people that had a lot of experience in the studio, that I don't even say it anymore, but I used to say, headphones okay for everybody?
Right.
And everybody would say, oh, yeah. It's just like non-issue to them because what they could hear was just fine.
Yeah.
But that's not always the case, particularly with people just starting out. And I don't think this was ever a situation for you, but for a lot of people, what they hear in their headphones is critical to them for performing.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes what they think they need is not really what's best for the performance.
Yeah.
So that's a decision that I have to make about if somebody says, I can't hear my guitar. Well, what is the real problem here?
Right.
Is the headphone volume too low overall? Do we just have to turn up his headphones?
Yeah.
That may be the solution.
Right.
Or it may be that some other instrument in the same range, a keyboard or a bass instrument, might be conflicting with what he's hearing, making it difficult for him to hear what he's doing.
Right.
In that case, there might be a different solution to solve that problem for them. In some studios, it's become pretty common to have everybody have their own little mixer that they can set up their headphones exactly the way they want them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do that because I don't think people really know what they need to hear properly.
Yeah.
I'd rather make that decision, and as long as everybody's happy, just that's it. But if somebody's having trouble, if they're struggling for one reason or another with hearing something themselves or somebody else that they need to hear, then that could be a problem that could be addressed. I would say way more than half the time, the problem can be solved just by turning our headphones up in general.
Yeah.
But there's other times when there is a problem and have to use different ways to solve that problem for them. But my experience has been with really good players, just give them almost anything and they're fine with it.
Yeah.
As long as it's, something reasonable. And I've mentioned this before on previous podcast episodes, but if a singer is straining too much, it may mean they don't have enough of their own voice in the headphones.
Right. Very true.
So I won't even say anything. I'll just turn them up a little bit in the headphones, and that'll get them to sort of back off and be more relaxed. To me, the less people are aware of the technical parts of it, the better.
Yeah, I think you're right.
They don't need that distraction.
No, you just want the flow.
Right. You want your focus to be on the performance and what you're doing, not on the technology.
Yeah.
So the goal is always, in every case, to make the technology as transparent as possible. And I think if people understand the studio technology a little bit, it will be helpful to them in realizing what they need. Mm-hmm. So they may realize that all they need is a little more headphone volume or a little less.
Right.
Okay, so we've got our microphones now picking up all this stuff, and it's going into the control room, into this sort of big black box at that point. And I'm not going to go into detail about that. But there's two basic approaches to getting that microphone into the recorder. And the recorder today is almost invariably a computer. So it's being recorded to a disk in the computer, either probably a solid state drive in the computer.
Yeah.
In the old days, it was going to a tape machine, but everything, it's the same process, just different hardware.
Yeah.
So the microphone output is just this little tiny minute thing because basically you're converting sound energy into electrical energy. That's what a microphone does. The output of a microphone is tiny signal. It's not enough to do anything.
Okay.
I mean, you can't do anything with it until you amplify it.
Right.
And that's the function of a microphone preamplifier, which is an extremely critical point in the recording process, which is something that I've always known. And that's, why my company, the first products we made were microphone preamplifiers, because if you mess it up there, it's gone forever.
Okay.
You might be able to correct some of the problems, but, it's never going to be perfect. So the way I record, and this is probably 50% or more of the way people record, is they take the microphone directly into a microphone preamplifier in the control room, and from there it just goes to the recorder. Generally, it's one microphone goes on one track. So tracks, what do you think of when I say tracks?
I just think of like there's a vocal track and there's a banjo track and there's all the separated instrument tracks.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's really no more complicated than that, although I think sometimes people tend to make it more complicated. And you'll hear people refer to them as tracks, or sometimes they'll call them stems.
Okay.
Which is really a term from the film industry, which in film work, they'll take, say, all the sound effects and combine them into one, essentially, fader, which is, one level control.
Okay.
So they don't have 6 or 10 that they have to move simultaneously.
Okay.
It's all into one. So they call those individual tracks stems because, as you can picture, it's a stem of multiple tracks.
Yeah.
So it isn't really accurate to call individual track stems, but that seems to be the way a lot of people
Right.
say it these days. So for people that are confused about that, I think it's helpful to realize that in current usage, they mean the same thing, but they're not really technically the same thing.
Right.
So you can go do the microphones into the microphone preamp into the recorder. And that's like super simple, clean path for the audio. And I'm always of the philosophy that the less you put stuff through, the better it sounds.
Right.
You know, I mean,
Because it condenses it down and down and down each time you do it.
well, I mean, each little deficiency in every piece of equipment just piles up on each other.
Right.
And the equipment today is really excellent. But if you run something through a whole bunch of different devices, you're starting to lose something each stage.
Sure.
You know, it may be a good trade-off because that extra device does something that you want to the sound. I always believe keeping it as simple as possible is always best.
Right.
You know, when I record certain things, I'll just go right from the microphone, mic preamp, right into the recorder.
Right.
And that's it. Other times, though, I know that it will make a better final product if I do something to that sound to modify it slightly at that stage, because I know I'm going to use that.
Right.
So one of the simplest examples would be when I'm doing something like this with a ribbon microphone with a lot of proximity effect, I'll just automatically run it through an equalizer that I can use to reduce some of that low end so that it sounds more natural.
Right.
So I can do that later, but if I do it at the earliest stage, then your headphones will sound better too.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And everybody will be able to hear better.
Right.
And the other thing that I do and I should define what an equalizer is. You know, it's kind of a confusing term. I mean, what are you making equal?
Right.
You know, you're not. You're changing things and making them unequal.
Right.
Historically, that goes back to the days of the telephone company. And that, in their case, they were trying to make all the frequencies equal.
Right.
By using something to correct for deficiencies in the signal path. In our current usage of that term, we're using it to either solve a problem or enhance the sound.
Right.
Essentially, all it is a really fancy tone control.
Okay.
So, you know, you have, you know, on your home stereo or even on your phone, I guess, you can change the balance between the bass and treble, and
Sure.
some of them have more adjustments in between. That's what we're doing with an equalizer. Generally speaking, equalizers in the studio are much more complex than, you know, what's on your home system or on your phone or computer.
Right.
But same idea. The other thing we might do while recording, and I do this on your vocal, is I run it through a compressor. Do you have any, what's your concept of what a compressor does?
I guess when I think about a compressor, I just think about it kind of squashing the sound down into a condensed version of what I've done. And I guess also when I think about it, I think if you do it too much, you're like getting rid of sounds somehow. It gets like less and less of what you originally had.
I think that's a pretty good explanation as far as it goes, but you can definitely use a compressor to do that, to make everything sound really squashed down. To my ear, that always makes things sound small.
Okay, right.
You know, I don't like that sound because you're eliminating the natural dynamics of your performance, right?
Right.
If you do too much of it.
Yeah.
The way a compressor works is that when sound is relatively low in volume, it doesn't do anything.
Right.
But if it gets above a certain point that we call the threshold, then it pushes it back down a little bit, right?
So in some ways that should be called the equalizer.
Yeah, that's probably true. Don't confuse people, though. But that's right. So I usually use just a little bit of that compression on your vocal when we're doing it because a lot of your songs have a pretty wide dynamic range.
Yes.
And this solves a couple of problems. One is that for everybody else listening, your vocal is more uniform in volume. Sounds more like the finished product than it would. And for another is this, especially with digital recording, and you know this from doing your own demos at home.
Right.
When you get to a certain point, when it gets above that level, it just turns into noise, junk. It's just unlistenable.
Yes.
And so we always have to make sure that we keep that level below that, what they call digital zero, which refers back to the old days of the VU meter, where the peak level was 0, which is kind of confusing because 0 we think of as nothing.
Right.
But in this case, it was the reference level maximum.
Okay.
The compressor can be used in that situation to make sure nothing ever goes beyond that. In reality, I'm much more conservative than that. So I make sure nothing ever goes above about -6. So that's
okay.
And I'm not going to go into dB and all that.
Right.
But that leaves a significant amount of buffer there for safety reasons.
Okay.
Because you never know what's going to happen. I see this all the time recording vocals where somebody, it's sounding so great to them in their headphones and they're really into the song and they just get carried away.
Right.
And even though engineer can anticipate that, throughout the session, when you're doing a vocal, you're going to get louder and louder. I mean, that's always the case.
Yeah.
So compensate for that ahead of time. But the compressor makes sure that nothing is ever going to ruin that take because it might be, once in a lifetime performance.
Okay, yeah.
For some people, they put it all out there in that performance and that may be the end of their voice for that day.
Sure.
And you don't want to not capture that.
Yeah.
So we use a compressor for that. Now, the other way that you can capture these sounds is very similar, but uses what's called a recording console.
Okay.
And this is, what do you think of, when you see a picture of a recording studio control room?
Yeah, I just think of the big console that's sort of the whole room with all the knobs on it. And
right.
Yeah.
And that used to be the way, there's no other option.
Right.
Because you just had a lot of microphones and you needed to be able to combine those as necessary to send them to the proper tracks that they're assigned to.
Yeah.
So the purpose of this console, which is sometimes called a mixing board, sometimes just called a board. In England, they call it a desk.
Oh, okay.
They all mean the same general thing. And they could be something small with just a few inputs, just a few controls on them, or they could be gigantic. And like when they're doing film scores and putting together all the music and dialogue and sound effects for a movie, those consoles can have hundreds of inputs. They're gigantic.
Yeah.
And when something gigantic like that, can you imagine what it costs?
No.
I mean, it's way into the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow. Yeah.
There's a lot of advantages to working that way because you have a physical layout of all your sources of sound, and you have a physical knob, what they call a fader, which, works up and down, not rotary.
Right.
And you can easily grab those and change those and everything. And that's a big advantage, especially in a really hectic, high-pressure recording situation. It's nice to have that. But those things take up a whole lot of room and eat your entire recording equipment budget, you know, because they're expensive.
Yeah.
They're really expensive.
Yeah.
So the tendency these days is to not use those. Although a lot of studios keep them in there, even though they're minimal use.
Yeah.
Just because
it's the
they're
look.
Impressive.
Yeah,
look,
it's
you
the
know?
look.
It impresses the clients.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love the look of a giant.
Me too.
They're beautiful.
Me too.
But I don't do that. For one thing, I don't have enough room.
Right.
Because, we're kind of a compact recording situation here. And I don't want to spend the money on that. I'd rather put it elsewhere.
Especially if there's no use for it.
Right. And I'm not really going to use it. So for the most part, they take the functions that we would use separate pieces of equipment and combine them into one. So they have the microphone preamplifier built into them. They have an equalizer built into them. And they may have a compressor built into them.
Wow, okay.
Okay. So almost all consoles have equalizers for every input, which is fine. Sometimes I think that encourages people to mess with them when they'd be better off leaving them alone.
Right.
Because I don't, except for like rolling off the bass on the ribbon microphones, I don't use equalization hardly at all.
Yeah.
Because I just don't. I'd rather use the right microphones and the right microphone placement and the right players, and then I don't have to do any of that.
You have to worry about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it just sounds more natural because, anytime you modify the sound, it could be impressive and do exactly what you want, but oftentimes it just introduces artifacts and things into the sound that, I just don't want to hear.
Yeah.
I want to keep it more pristine sounding. Those consoles, when you look at them, generally down at the bottom where, your hands are the faders. There's just millions of those in a row, depending on the console.
Yeah.
And then you have things that equalizer knobs, you can change everything. And then you might have a compressor. And then you also have something called a pan pot.
Okay.
And this is how you take what's essentially a monaural signal, just, a point source signal, and position it somewhere in the stereo image, between left and right. Mm-hmm. And these days where more and more stuff is being recorded and mixed in what they call immersive formats, Dolby Atmos is the best known one, where you have multiple speakers all around you and up and down, and you can have up to, almost limitless number of speakers depending on your budget. And you have essentially controls that allow you to position that sound anywhere around you, anywhere up and down. For me, I just work in stereo, but I always record stuff, at least for the last couple of years, with those immersive formats in mind.
Yeah.
Because I'm not set up to mix those, but, I have good friends and clients that that's what they do, and they're really, really good at it. And so at some point we might do something like that.
Yeah. Sounds great.
Which could be fun.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the pan pots on a console are just left and right.
Okay.
So, and anywhere in between. But we'll talk more about this when we get to mixing. We would have the pan pots, the equalizer, maybe a compressor, and then generally there's a lot of buttons which allow us to route that signal to whatever track we want it to go to. Generally, most recording these days is one mic to one track.
Okay.
In the old days, tape machines had a limited number of tracks. 24 track was basically how many tracks were used in most recorders.
Okay.
And that uses 2-inch wide tape.
Okay. Wow.
That was a luxury because you had all these tracks. You could put everything on, or most things on separate tracks.
Right.
Today, with digital recording, there's no limit to the tracks.
Wow.
I mean, if there is, it's in the hundreds.
Okay.
All right. So I'll never
reach it.
I think the most I ever used was 32 tracks on something.
Wow.
And that was, a singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist who wanted to do everything himself.
Oh my gosh.
So we ended up using a lot of tracks.
Sure.
But on most of your songs, we're only using 8, 12 tracks, 16 sometimes tracks.
Yeah.
Back in those days, if you had, say, a drum kit, you might want to combine all the individual drum mics into one track or one stereo track or some combination, of fewer than the number of mics. So you use the console to combine different microphones and assign them to tracks in stereo,
Yeah.
or however you wanted to do it. The console also has all kinds of other provisions for controlling the headphones,
Okay.
so that you can provide the proper mix for the headphones, and then sort of overall controls to control the overall level that you're listening to in the control room. Or if you have speakers in the studio that people can hear playback, you have a control for that.
Right.
So they're a great way to sort of centralize all that kind of control stuff. But there's other ways to do that. And the way that most people do that today, because they're recording on a computer, is what they call a digital audio workstation, which is usually just called a DAW.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of that.
It is more or less a software emulation of that giant console.
Okay.
All right. So they often look very similar to the actual physical console.
Okay.
With the same kinds of knobs and faders and controls and stuff on them. That's a good way to do it. I mean, one really good thing about it is it only has to be as big as the number of tracks you need. And if you start out with 16 or 20 or 30 tracks, but you don't need that many, the unused ones you can eliminate. And it's just like taking your giant console and chopping off a section of it.
Right.
Or on the other extreme, if you start out with a few number of tracks and then realize you need a lot more, you can just add additional tracks to the screen display of this.
Right.
Which you can't do in a real console. When you run out of real inputs, you're done.
Yeah.
There aren't any more. I think that sort of explains to some extent, I hope, the control room.
I think it explains it really well, yeah.
Okay, anything about that you have questions about?
No, I think it laid it out really well. There was a lot that I actually didn't understand, but it all makes sense. And I've heard all of the terms, but have never really thought through or taken any time to think about, what they do or what their actual impact is.
Right. Good. Let's talk about mixing.
Okay.
Because this is, for a lot of people, a really mysterious process. And it's interesting that in the old days, most engineers that recorded the song also mixed the song. These days, it seems to be more often farmed out to somebody that only does mixing.
Okay.
Especially with big, major artists. They usually have somebody else do the mixing, which I think is fine. I mean, the people that do that are really, really good at it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, for me, I prefer to have that kind of overall concept of what I want.
Yeah.
That starts out, with you and me sitting down and talking about the songs.
Yeah.
And what we want to do with them and the instruments we want to use, and, just having an overall sense of this song and what do we want from it, and carrying that all the way through to the end product.
Yeah.
That just seems to be for me anyway, a better way of achieving the vision that I have for the song and making sure that I achieve your vision of the song.
Yeah, it's understanding what the music means.
Right.
Which would be hard to do for someone separate from the process.
Right. If they just get this thing in, with a dozen other songs they have to mix not that day because it takes longer than that, but they have a bunch of them in their queue of songs they have to mix. Those guys really do their homework listening to the song over and over and over and over again in a variety of situations, so they get a good understanding of it. But good as they are at doing that, man, I think they're terrific at it, and they really are successful. They don't know you.
Right. Right. Or the story, or where the stories come from, or why you're doing the music. Right.
And most of those guys are pretty good, and girls too. I mean, it's not just a male thing.
Yeah.
They're really good at picking up on that. They have that kind of sensitivity to the stuff that it makes it work for them. And there may be times in the future where I decide that it might be better to have somebody else mix this thing. But
Yeah.
for the most part, I want to do it.
Yeah.
You know, you're not there when I'm mixing stuff. Which
Right.
I'd be happy to have you there, but it's just not practical.
Yeah.
So I do it on my own. And then, you know, I'll usually send you what I'm working on, and maybe at various stages of the thing, just to get your feedback on
Right.
it. I think our working relationship is so good that I somehow managed to get just what you want.
Yeah, we tend to agree. And also, I think that you're a little more objective. So you're really listening for things that need a little support. Or if you're hearing something that needs, you know, a little cover, or a little something that's a little brass, you figure it out right away. I can't always hear those details because I'm so intimately involved in the song itself.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, before we get into some of those details, let me just ask you what you think goes on when I'm doing that, or anybody's doing a mix. What are they doing?
Well, that's a great question. In my mind, they're just trying to get all of the players and all of the parts to sound like one unit, smooth, flawless sound. If there's any mistakes, figuring out a way to make it sound less obvious. So maybe turning down the volume on a mistake. I guess I do really have that imagery of like, okay, there's a terrible mess right there, and you just get rid of it or something in some way. Or maybe one experience I had, but this wasn't really mixing either, in that original recording experience I had was, you know, I was so nervous trying to play in front of the microphones for the first time that I was really struggling. And it was actually looped. So I could play something that I was going to play over and over again, and that was actually looped in, so I didn't have to do the entire thing. So I guess that's what I imagine with mixing, is just cleaning it up, fixing problems, equalizing sound. And yeah, maybe that's all I know.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's probably a good starting point. I mean, the obvious thing is getting the proper balance between all the sounds, you know, and that is something that I tend to do as a process from the beginning.
Right.
You know, so when I get to the mixing stage, I don't really have a lot of decisions to make, because one of the great things about the digital audio workstation is that it can remember all that stuff. So as we're going through the song and putting parts on and adding things, each time we finish one of those things, I do a new mix of it, but I don't have to start from scratch each time.
Okay.
So that saves a lot of time. And it also makes it practical for me to sort of essentially gather all my thoughts about how this should fit together. Not just sit down one day and do it, but just as a gradual process as I understand the song better. So that's, you know, the fundamental part of doing a mix. You know, there are times when you have to do corrective things, like you mentioned. Generally speaking, if somebody hits a bad note, if we, for some reason, left that in, hopefully we corrected that earlier some way.
Right.
But assuming, you know, nobody noticed it and all of a sudden it's there, then it's a matter of what can we do to fix this? And if you just like cut it out, pull it out, like if a bass note's wrong, it's like, oh, what happened? You know, it's like everything feels funny because suddenly there's no bass there for that instant.
Yeah.
So that's not a good solution. So let's say we have a take that's otherwise really, really good, that everybody likes the feel of, it's good and everybody performed well, but the bass player played one wrong note. There may be ways we can fix that. You know, in the digital age, it's a lot simpler. So chances are that's not the only time that note ever occurred. So I can go, let's say it's in a chorus, he missed a note. I can go back to a different chorus, and where he plays that note in the corresponding spot, I can copy and paste just like you do in a word processor and take that note and put it where the bad note used to be.
Wow.
And that's a pretty straightforward way of correcting things.
Yeah.
Another thing you can do, and I didn't have to do many of these things on your album, but there was one song, and I don't remember which one it was, where there's like a rubato at the end where everybody slows down a little bit.
Yeah.
And then there's a final note, and the drums, cello, and guitar didn't all hit that exactly
in time
with each other. So I could take, the cello, which is essentially the bass part in the song.
Sure.
I can take that part that maybe he was a little late and just cut and paste it and just move it up a tiny bit.
Okay.
So that it now lines up with the drums.
Wow.
And that may be all it needs. I think that's all I had to do.
Wow.
And I don't remember whether it was the cello or the guitar.
Right.
But one of those, and when you have a drummer, he sets the time.
Right.
So he's the king of the time.
Yeah.
So we move everything to match what he did. And that's an easy fix. What I found was that if I made it precisely in time, it sounded kind of obvious. Mm-hmm. So I left it a little bit off.
Okay.
Just because it felt better that way.
Okay.
It felt more
natural.
More natural, So those are some of the things you can do. Now, when you're adjusting the levels, the balance between things, in an ideal situation, you get that perfect balance, and you just hit basically, okay, my mix is done. Record this mix. I don't know that there were any of your songs that I could do that. Well, maybe some of the things you did solo.
Right.
I could do that with. But with everybody else, there were times when I thought that this part should be a little louder than it was originally played. This part might need to be a little quieter there. In the old days, you did that with a fader manually.
Right.
And if you had a complicated song with a lot of tracks, with a lot of things that needed correcting, it would take several people. And the mix was a performance. You were there, and just like the players, not everybody got it perfectly every time.
Right.
So you might have to do it multiple times till you got it right.
Right.
These days in digital, like so many other aspects of our digital world, it's much simpler.
Yeah.
Because you can use what's called automation. And this essentially, in terms of the level, the balance between the instruments, is that we can actually make the changes we want and have them, essentially permanently recorded in there. You can do that by actually moving the fader.
Wow.
Which, to me, moving the fader with a mouse, I just don't have the kind of control over that I want.
Right.
So I generally, most people do it that way, and they make it work fine, and that's great. But I just have trouble getting what I want. It's just too time-consuming to get the perfect thing.
Right.
So there's a way that you can actually specify the points on the screen where, okay, right now this guitar solo has to come up. But you have to do it in a natural way. It can't just be all of a sudden, wow, the guitar just got a whole lot louder.
Right.
You got to make it seem natural.
Right.
So you bring the guitar up for the solo and then bring it back down again. And you can refine that as much as you need to get it just the way you want it to sound.
Yeah.
That, to me, is like the beauty of digital recording, that you have that ability to make those kinds of changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yeah. And I don't do it with your vocals, but with some singers, I do a lot of automation on their vocal rather than using the compression.
Okay.
Because I don't really like how their voice responds to the compression. It doesn't sound natural to me or isn't appropriate for the song. I think on your vocal, I did that on one song, one word that was just getting lost. And I said, I really want to hear that word. I want people to understand that because it's part of the story.
Right.
So I just did a little blip up and down.
Yeah.
And it sounds perfectly natural.
Oh, wow. That's great.
It's just for whatever reason you didn't sing. Maybe you were running out of breath or whatever.
Fade out of it, yeah.
Or you moved a little bit on the mic, and that fixed it perfectly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting.
And then, and this is a good example, again, from your album, is we have the cello being plucked, a pizzicato style of playing that essentially performs the bass function.
Right.
And Peter's just so good at that.
He's amazing.
Yeah. But the problem is, and it isn't necessarily limited to the cello. It could be a double bass or electric bass or whatever. But on at least one of the songs, Adam, the guitar player, is playing in a different tuning, where he tuned the lowest E string on the guitar down. I forget what it was. But anyway, that put it in the same range as the cello playing that fundamental note, right?
Yeah.
And they were confusing each other. It was like this conflict going on that made the whole thing sound muddy.
Right.
And I heard that when we were recording it and sort of had this whole process in mind for how I was going to fix that.
Right.
And essentially what I did was I took a little bit of the bass frequencies out of the guitar, and I emphasized some of the higher frequencies in the cello.
Wow.
So now they fit together and they don't conflict with each other, even when they're playing the same note.
That's so interesting.
So that solved that problem.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that process.
Well, one of these days you'll be here for that. When I approach a mix, I think of it as putting the puzzle together, because you have all these puzzle pieces of all the tracks you've recorded. In a perfect world, they'd all fit together easily, and you'd have the full picture of your puzzle put together. It doesn't always work that way, because there's just times when, it may not even be corrective. It may be enhancive, if there's such a word.
Right, right.
That I can say, we can make this sound better by making this puzzle piece, essentially taking that puzzle piece and taking an X-Acto knife and changing the shape of that puzzle piece to fit better with another puzzle piece, Right. So that's I always look at it as a giant puzzle to put together. Another really important aspect of mixing is making sure that the final mix is going to sound right in a wide variety of listening situations.
Right.
And that's always challenging. At least for me, it's always challenging. It's always a compromise. So you have to be willing to, let go of some things that you really, really like the way they sound in, the multi-$1,000 speakers in the control room, and say, how is this going to sound on somebody's phone?
Right.
If they're listening in earbuds or laptop speakers or whatever, however they're listening. All those listening environments are equally valid, and you have to provide something to them that sounds right. That's another big challenge in the mixing process. The balance, well, let's just say for your vocal, because in your songs, the vocals are really important because they're stories, and you got to hear all the words.
Yes.
And we talked about this right from the beginning, that I was going to mix your songs with a vocal way out front.
Yes.
Because it's important.
Yeah.
I mean, not only is your voice wonderful, but the story's wonderful. And we want to make sure people can hear it.
Yes.
Then I get into the conflict in the mixing process where what sounds right in the studio monitors doesn't sound right in those other environments.
Right.
So I have to make all those compromises to make sure that it's going to sound good in every situation, or as good as it can sound.
Sure.
In your case, the goal was always to make sure, first and foremost, that you could hear every word,
Yeah.
no matter what.
Yeah.
So that's challenge one. And then the next challenge is to make sure it just doesn't sound like you singing with a whole bunch of people 50 feet in back of you playing.
Yeah.
Because it's got to sound like they're part of the music, too.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to go into the details about how to do that, but I will say one thing that I do is I have this little tiny speaker. You've seen it in there. It's this little pink thing.
Yeah.
And it basically sounds like a phone speaker or a laptop speaker.
Yeah.
And I can just flip a switch and listen to the mix going through that.
Yeah.
That'll tell me a lot. I mean, the first thing it tells me is, oh, geez, what happened to my music? It's
my
just,
beautiful music.
Yeah. I thought this mix was sounding great. Now it sounds awful.
Right.
You know. So then what I'll do is I'll change the mix so that it's starting to sound better in that little speaker.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll put it back on the big speakers and say, now I don't like really the way it sounds in the big speakers.
Right.
But people at home don't have those speakers.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Another thing that I'll do is I might play it on the big speakers or on that little tiny speaker, and I'll just put it like at a normal listening level. You know, most people don't listen to music very loud.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll leave the control room, and I'll go over and I'll sit in the shop, which is right next door.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right? And I'm in a position where I don't hear any of the direct sound from whatever speaker's reproducing it. And that just, reduces it to its essence.
Right.
And if I can make it sound good that way, if I can understand every word and I can hear, at least the support of all the other instruments in there, then that's probably going to work pretty well for people.
That's awesome.
So that takes a lot of time.
That sounds like it.
Yeah. And it's just making compromises I really don't want to make.
Yes.
I'd much rather just mix it for the big monitor speakers and just enjoy it that way, but you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is the overall loudness.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting concept, which has been a challenge in any kind of audio from the very beginning, going back to the 1920s.
Right.
Or probably even before. Obviously, people in almost all listening situations, unless it's out of their control, there's a volume control. So if something's not loud enough, they can turn it up.
Yeah.
If it's too loud and annoying, they can turn it down. But when you have something like a radio station playing your music,
right,
or even more to the point these days, a streaming service that's playing your music,
right,
and you're part of a playlist with other artists, you want to make sure that your song, is at least in the ballpark loudness-wise with everything else.
Right.
Right? The solution to that in the old days was you just made it as loud as you could possibly make it.
Right.
And the way you make it louder is not by turning the volume up, because there's a limit,
Right.
You can't make it any louder than that just because you can't.
Right.
But to put a ton of compression on it,
okay,
which made everything like so
right,
up there and level all the time.
Yeah.
But that just sort of destroys the music.
Right.
You have no more dynamic range.
Right.
And it's just not a pleasant listening experience.
Yeah.
And you'll hear this on the radio, because the radio takes a mix that somebody did that probably has a good deal of compression on it to begin with. And then they go and add just a ton more compression to it. So everything just is constantly at that same level, which I find unlistenable.
Right.
I can't listen to that.
Yeah.
It just gets on my nerves instantly.
Yeah.
To their credit, the streaming services have decided that what they're going to do is normalize all the music, which means every song is going to have the same level.
Okay.
Which is great for the listeners, because then you don't have something that's like jumps out and
Right.
screams in your face, and then the next thing you just can't hear.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
So they've set a standard level of loudness, which is different than the level we read on a meter.
Yeah, right.
Because it's your perception of the sound. It's a very subjective thing, loudness. So they've developed ways of measuring loudness that, as best as possible, correspond to our concept of how loud something is.
Right.
Not perfect by any means, but it certainly gets it closer. The standards that the streaming services use is generally what I use as the level that I'm going to aim for. And the way I achieve that loudness level, where necessary, is by using some overall compression on the mix, and then just, using the built-in tools in the software to tell me, how loud is this?
Okay.
Does this fit the standard or not?
Right.
So I make all the songs on the album all fit that standard. So that you have to understand that this is what they call integrated over the length of the song.
Right.
So some of your songs start out with just you, very quiet, maybe just vocal, or maybe you and banjo.
Right.
And then they build.
Yep.
And some songs like Angel's Teeth have huge differences in dynamics in them.
Yes.
So when you set that so that the overall loudness level is right, it may not sound right with what came before and what came after.
Right.
It's just,
it's the compromise.
It's the compromise you have to make. Because if you make it too loud, the streaming services are just going to bring it down.
Right.
And all of a sudden your songs, it's going to sound small.
Right.
And we don't want it to sound small.
No.
So that's another aspect of mixing, that you want that. And then, in your case, since we were making a CD, we talked about it before. Really, I got much into the mixing thing about what's the sequence of the song's going to be.
Right.
Because that's really important. That was easy for us because I just came up with a proposed list and you just said, that seems right to me.
Yeah.
I think I sent it to you.
Yeah, exactly.
So you could listen
it
to
was
hear.
Perfect.
When you go from one song to the next, even though the integrated loudness is equal from one to the next, the difference between something that ends big and the next song that begins quiet makes it sound like that other song is really low in volume.
Right.
So that's, another compromise you make.
Right.
Do I bring up that intro part so that
Right.
it's more compatible with what they just heard before if they're listening to the whole album, or listening to it on a streaming thing where you don't know what's coming before?
Right.
Or do I keep those natural dynamics of it, which is, to me, it's more exciting that way.
Yeah, right.
The
Me
contrast is part of the way you wrote the song.
Yeah, definitely.
So all those things go into decisions made in the mixing process. And there's more. I don't want to go into a lot of other detail, but that just gives you the sort of the main things about it. Any questions about that? Anything that occurs to you?
No, I think just more that's something that I learned in the process because, I didn't realize once we were done recording, wherever I would send it, that it would become compressed more. And each place, the streaming services, radio. So I was just completely unaware of that process. And so I knew you were making those compromises and I was grateful for it. And now understand I'm going to send something to a radio station soon and they're going to put it through something else and then put it on the radio. So it's kind of amazing, what that process looks like. You might not be getting the exact sound that you started with.
Right.
And so I think it takes a really careful mixer to understand that so that you can still get the power you want behind your songs.
Well, and, that leads into another topic, and that is, how are these people going to be hearing this music? We're listening to the songs in the control room.
Yes.
And they're full
glory,
the best possible way that you could ever hear this song.
Yes.
With a realization that nobody else is going to hear it that way.
That's right.
And so we have to take into account not only what are they going to hear it on, is it going to be on their phone speaker? Because if there's a couple people there and they all want to hear the song, that's probably how they're going to hear it.
Oh, yeah. I hear lots of music just that way.
Right. Yeah, especially if it's part of a video.
Yep.
Are they going to hear it in earbuds? That's a different thing.
Yep.
But more to our point here is, what format is that going to be in from a technical point of view? Because when we record your songs, we record often the basic tracks of that song, sometimes some of your songs, all of them, in what's called DSD, which is like the super high resolution format. Ultimately, that gets converted down to a WAV file, which I think everybody's familiar with.
Yes.
Which is a good format.
Yes.
DSD, I think, sounds better, but WAV files sound great too.
Yeah.
So it's a legitimate high-quality format. But they take up a lot of storage space.
Right.
They're huge, huge files.
Right.
Back in the early days of music players, which could have been an iPod or a phone, the storage capability was very limited. So if you wanted to have 1,000 songs on your phone, they wouldn't fit if they were the full resolution.
Right.
And I will ever be impressed with how they did this, but really good people that not only were great technically, but also were great listeners, figured out a way that they could reduce the file size significantly. Okay. And that became the MP3.
Right.
And the MP3, there's lots of variations of that. They're all similar process, slightly different ways of doing it.
Right.
They've reduced the file size a whole lot. I mean, you can set the quality level of that to some extent, depending on the storage that's going to be available to you.
Right.
So if you use one of the smaller file size formats, essentially up to 90% of that recording is thrown away.
Wow.
And yet, doesn't sound bad.
Yeah, it's okay.
It's definitely listenable. For those of us that have heard the full resolution and then compare that to the MP3, it's not so great. But it's a good format for the consumer.
Yes.
So we have to make sure that whatever we do in the recording and mixing process is going to translate well to that.
Yeah, right.
And that doesn't really require a whole lot of change in the way we approach it, but you do have to keep that in mind.
Yes, yeah.
If you just have the original WAV file from our mixes, I can convert that to an MP3, pretty high resolution MP3, and that goes to the consumer directly that way. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
For most people, they've never heard anything that sounds better than that.
Right. Yeah, right.
That's just their standard of what music sounds like. Where the problem arises is if that gets converted once again into another MP3 or equivalent.
Right.
And the terminology here is a little confusing because that's usually called digital compression, which sort of, it's like confusing with the idea of a compressor, which is an entirely different thing.
Right.
But you'll hear that term. It's been digitally compressed.
Yes.
And, I always say reduced file size because I don't want that confusion.
Right.
So those formats throw away so much of the information.
Right.
And one time, that's okay. You do it a second time, that same thing, and then you convert it to another MP3 or other kind of thing. It starts sounding pretty bad. I don't want to go into the technical description of what sounds bad about it, but I think anybody will notice that it doesn't sound as good as it should.
Okay, yeah.
It's important that when we provide this music to some source we have no control over, like a streaming service or the radio, we want to make sure that their digital file size reduction scheme is not going to take a lower resolution version and then make it even lower resolution version.
Yeah.
So that's why when I do the mixes, we end up generally with 3 different versions.
A video version.
Right.
A WAV version and an MP3.
Exactly. Because video has different standards, so, which is fine. I mean, it works fine. But you have to be aware of that and make sure that you can provide all those different formats optimized as much as you can.
Yeah.
And then make sure that you use the right one when you send it to somebody.
Yes. Yes, which does scare me sometimes. I am always double checking that.
Right. In the upcoming third and final part of my conversation with Corrie Lynn Green, we deviate somewhat from the technology of the studio and discuss the role of the producer. There are plenty of additional topics that Corrie and I could discuss if there's sufficient interest. We can do more the next time Corrie is here for recording. Please let me know if you found this episode helpful, and feel free to suggest topics for this or any other area of recording that you would like to hear about. You can reach me at dwfern@dwfern.com. I'm sure you know people who could benefit from this information. Please direct them to this podcast and share on your social media. Thanks. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.